This is a really tough question. So what I'm going to get you to do actually is just get in your head. I know it's early to be interactive, but just you don't have to talk to anybody. I won't do role plays, anything like that. Just get in your head, if I said to you, that person has an eating disorder, what are the sort of things that come up for you? Just spend a minute, just linger over the question. Like think what they're wearing. What does that tell you about their socioeconomic status? Think about what magazines they're probably going to be reading. You might want to think about gender. You might want to think about what they look like. Anyone got a kind of image in your head of what that's going to be like? No one? Okay. Yeah, thank you. Interactivity. The first slide.
Most likely to be female.
Yep.
High percentage of female.
Yep.
As a starting point.
Yep, totally.
Younger.
Younger. Yep. Absolutely.
I was just thinking, it could be you or me.
Yeah.
It literally, it's not a type per se.
Yep. Absolutely. Most people, when we ask it, and you guys are here, so you're kind of a selective audience, but most people, when you ask it, are going to think young, highly emaciated, high socioeconomic status, obsessed with modeling and Vogue, and I'll update it, like Instagram, because we are getting older, and highly emaciated, someone with, usually the thought is someone of severe anorexia nervosa, who probably needs to be in an inpatient unit. That's the stereotypical kind of image. And it's actually what we completely and utterly need to rethink. This picture, and I think it's on my website, certainly on our Facebook page, was done by someone called Mary, who at one point in her life was living in a large body and worked really, really, really hard to lose lots and lots of weight. So she ate pretty much nothing, and she exercised for hours and hours a day. And she managed to lose a significant amount of weight. So her BMI went from about 31, which would be in the obese range, down to about 22.5, which is slap bang in the middle of the bell curve of healthy. She didn't binge, she didn't purge, she didn't take laxatives. She had just lost a heap of weight and looked, from mind's eye, absolutely, completely normal. And she was pissed off as hell because nobody would take her eating problem seriously. She found it very difficult to get access to any treatment centre or anyone even to take blood tests because she didn't have that classic look of somebody that people think about had anorexia nervosa. And I really like this image. So you got someone who's maybe living in a larger body, someone who, okay, we can see kind of a backbone, it's a more skeletal kind of image. We got someone kind of in the normal weight range. We got someone who's meant to represent someone a bit older. And I'll talk a little bit about older age onset down the track. And very importantly, we've got a male. And I actually think it's probably a bit outdated, actually, from a cultural perspective, and possibly also from a gender identity perspective. There's a whole lot of other people, other groups that when we're thinking about eating disorders, we don't actually put them in unless we stop and think that all of these people can suffer from a life-threatening eating disorder. So it's an intro class, but I may or may not be preaching to the converted. That is point number one. Eating disorders are the least discriminating illness you can have. They can affect anybody. So, Christine put up a lot of positive facts. I'm by nature a fairly negative human being, so I come from the other direction. But the myth is that you can tell and make a diagnosis from somebody just by looking at them. Okay. I just mentioned you by name, Christine. It's really freaky that you came in. As Christine said, 4 main types of eating disorders. And we'll talk about prevalence and things like that in a tick. But, you know, the one that most people kind of think about when they think about anorexia, you know, in a mistaken kind of way, is anorexia nervosa. So what you see in anorexia nervosa is this restriction of food intake, which is the classical thing, which leads to a significantly low body weight, less than we'd expect, and an intense fear of weight gain and fatness. There is a big anxiety disorder component to this illness. Disturbance in body image, which I think is one of the most fascinating parts of an illness, and I will get a bit geeky later on, and there'll be pictures of brains and stuff, because it's actually really helpful in understanding some of the processes and the brain processes that happen. Because once we do that, we actually can start to destigmatize eating disorders even further. So we'll come back to disturbance in body image. Self-evaluation is unduly influenced by weight and shape, which is this throwaway line that people talk about in eating disorders, but it's both there in anorexia and bulimia, but it is the core feature on one level. I think there are lots of other levels to eating disorders, but it's the core feature. And I might explain it by the way that we kind of explain it in the clinic room. So what I might get, again, I'll get you to kind of think a little bit. What we mean by self-evaluation is what's important to me as a human being. And a good way of thinking about what's important to you as a human being is to think, if I lost something, how bad would that make me feel? So if you've got pens and paper, you can write it down, otherwise you can do it in your head. This is not a sharing kind of exercise. I want you to think about what's really important to you as people. So if I was doing the exercise, which I've done many, many times, if my phone rang and both my kids were dead, that would have a massive impact on me. So that tells me something. Being a father is important to me. Being a husband is important to me. Working in this sector is actually really important to me. So just have a think. If you lose something or something's threatened to be lost, what are the most important things to you? And what we do in the clinic room to kind of just get people thinking about this is we draw a big pie chart. And we kind of divide it up into sectors of importance. So again, have a think about what your pie chart might start to look like. And I'm hoping that it's this really balanced kind of pie chart with, personality characteristics, work, hobbies, relationships, all that kind of stuff. Let's just assume that, because it's just going to be easier if I assume that. When somebody presents with an eating disorder, almost that pie chart initially is almost exclusively just weight, shape, and appearance. And so your whole sense of identity, who you are as a person, is determined by what you look like. Which is why, particularly anorexia, can be a really difficult illness to treat. So let's take a little example, right? Let's say your kids, and if you have kids with eating disorders and you're here, this is going to be like a boom example, right? Let's say I came up to you and I went, I really know that you think your kids are important to you. And you really kind of think that you want to hold on to them and you like them, but look, really, they're going to cost you about $250,000 by the time you educate them and feed them. Think of all the things you could do with this money, right? I have convinced people to give their children back at the end of this metaphor, but please don't say that. You are being taped and your kids could watch it. Like there's sleepless nights, there's heartache, they bring friends over and you can't watch what you want to watch and they play loud music and they're horrible little things. I know you're attached to them, but I'm a professional parenting person and I'm going to just take your kid away from you because it's good for you, trust me. Who at that point is not going to feel a wee bit irritated with me? And you might even fight to hold on to something that is the most important thing to you in your life. This is where other people go, oh, no, please take my kids. But if they're the most important thing to you, you don't give it up without a fight. And there's reasons why people with eating disorders, anorexia and bulimia, and I think it's undervalued actually in binge eating disorder, this overvaluation of weight and shape. But it is almost the entire self-concept that they have. And just thinking that you can give that up is kind of crazy. You fight to defend who you think you are. And I think that's why on one level it's the core psychopathology, because it goes from this kind of weight and shape level into this really important underlying sense of self and who I am as a person. I've forgotten where I am. Persistent lack of recognition of the seriousness of low weight, which we always used to, and it's actually changed in the diagnostic criteria. It used to be denial of low weight, which is actually a really pejorative way of thinking about something. It's just like, there's actually neurological reasons why people don't think they're at a low weight. Like at Uluru, we were sitting around a campfire, and Celeste, if you watch this video, you've become a metaphor, I'm sorry. But we're talking about, that question of like, oh, what do you do? And I got I'm a clinical psychologist and everyone takes 5 steps backwards because we can read minds, so I know what everyone's thinking. What are you laughing at? I actually do. No, they don't, they're just the voices in the head. But one of the things that Celeste did, amongst other people, is go, oh, I'd really like a bit of that anorexia. And I'll bring up how I responded to that. I've got much better at responding to that. I can hear, whenever anyone asks me that question, my wife goes, oh, he's going to go off on a tirade again. But we'll actually talk about why people don't recognise this stuff. They're not crazy. They're actually just doing what their brain is telling them to do. It's just their brain is wired wrong, which maybe isn't an intro level in terms of what to do about that, but actually understanding that point is absolutely crucial to understand what is happening. If you're a clinician and you're in primary healthcare, it's like what is happening in the room for you is driven by neurobiology. So that's anorexia nervosa. Bulimia nervosa. Recurrent binge eating. Another thing that you get around a campfire is you're on holiday, everyone's eating a lot, someone eventually will go, oh, I'm binging. And I go, no, you're not. I'm really annoying socially, by the way. I have very few social skills. I just launch into lectures for unknown reasons. I go, that's actually not binge eating. What you're doing is eating maybe more than you're comfortable with eating, maybe you're eating more than you normally would, but it's actually in a context of you're on holiday. So people don't binge at Christmas, you don't binge at Easter, you just eat like everyone else does. That's what people do, they overeat. But it gets kind of labelled as a binging. A binge has two features. One is you're eating, an objective binge is you're eating an enormous amount of food. Kind of like the figures vary, normal kind of eating for weight maintenance is about 2,200 calories or something. A binge is usually around 1,000 in the literature. So it's a lot of food. So you don't do that at Christmas or around a campfire. The other thing that happens is you feel completely and utterly out of control. You cannot not start once the thought gets in your head, and you cannot stop. It's not... Choice is a controversial word in the clinic room with patients. You might choose to binge, but you can't choose to stop. You just keep going, and it drives, and it drives, and it drives. Now, people who suffer from bulimia also have this self-evaluation that's overly influenced by how they eat, about their weight and their shape. So if you've just binged, and it's usually one of the main triggers to it is dieting, so you're trying to actually keep your weight low. Body doesn't like that. So if you try and keep your weight low, food will smell better, food will taste better. If you look at what ads, if you give them a magazine to look at and you monitor the time spent on the pages, the food ads and the food recipes will have much more time spent on them. That is actually just the brain doing what it's meant to do, which is, oh, we're in famine, I'm going to make sure that you remember to eat. It's actually like evolution. That's just what's happening there. But you're trying to control your weight because that's who you are and what's the most important thing to you. But then you completely blow it by this thing that you just don't want to do. So your whole sense of who you are just got blown up. And in a way, your head's going, well, I did that. So what sort of idiot am I? I've got no control over this. And so the sense of guilt and shame that comes along with binging is enormous. And so if you have a diagnosis of bulimia nervosa, what you do is try and fix the damage, in inverted commas, done by the binging. So you often redouble your efforts and you restrict again and you do it again. And then, this will get boring in a second, your brain goes, oh, you really need to eat. So you get flooded with signals to eat. So this cycle happens and you feel awful and you feel bad, so you compensate. So you might compensate through vomiting behavior or taking laxatives or over-exercise. But hopefully that kind of gives you, with anorexia and bulimia, just this kind of flavor of the cycle. And like one of the things that good old Celeste talked about was like when she goes, I want to have a bit of an eating disorder, and she implies that there's like a choice. You don't get a choice when you're stuck. You're trapped in these kind of illnesses. Binge eating disorder is the most common eating disorder, but it's the one that we've just really only started thinking about, that it might be an important eating disorder. The process of binging is pretty much the same. In fact, if you want to get really geeky and look at the diagnostic criteria, their description of a binge in binge eating disorder is a lot better than the binge in bulimia. It's exactly the same. Clinically, there's no difference between them. but they really stress the distress and the guilt and the shame in binge eating disorder. But although I think there is growing information that people who have binge eating disorder do have a high level of self-evaluation based on weight and shape, it's just that I'm not sure people are asking the right questions. They don't use the compensatory behaviours. There's often sometimes less of a dietary restriction part to the binges in binge eating disorder. Certainly my clinical field is they're very different presentations, and that binge eating disorder is a lot more about regulation of emotion, regulation of mood. One of my patients, I don't think it was me who did it. I think it was someone, hopefully it was someone outside, let's just assume. It was someone, because otherwise it's going to look terrible. Someone outside the clinic room said, oh, it's like comfort eating. And I just sort of reflected that, it's like comfort eating. And she got furious and made the very important point, there is nothing comfortable at all about what I'm doing. It might be there to numb out my emotions, but it's not a comfortable thing to do. Other specified feeding and eating disorders used to kind of be called EDNOS, which was like they're people with some eating thing that we don't really know what they are. But it ended up that was about 50% of the people, which basically means your diagnostic criteria are just rubbish. So which is why we changed them. Well, when I say we, I had nothing to do with it, but other people, smart people. And they did a pretty good job. They've actually, rather than a big catch-all kind of category, they're specifying that there are these things like, in fact, Mary, who did that diagram, would possibly be anorexia nervosa, but probably more accurately, technically would be diagnosed as having atypical anorexia nervosa. She should be in that OSFED range. And that's often someone who's lost a lot of weight, but they've stayed in that normal weight range. So subthreshold bulimia nervosa. So it's kind of like subclinical presentations in this group. The problem with them is I cannot find any data that tells me the level of suffering in that box is any different to the level of suffering in any of the other boxes, except they find it harder to be taken seriously and get treatment, which is a lot of suffering in that box. There's an idea, someone wrote a book, and I get what she was saying, but she called it almost anorexia, which was like, oh, that's not a good title for your book. And she was trying to highlight there's this other category of people who are subclinical, but almost anorexia, not a good title. There are other eating disorders that we categorize, which I'm not actually going to talk about today. The most prevalent is ARFID, Avoidant Restrictive Food Intake Disorder. Dumbest name of anything ever. So I just call it ARFID, which again is it's best thought of a really severe picky eating, which some people think kids just will grow out of, but we've kind of seen, in fact, my first case that I ever saw of anybody presenting with ARFID was a guy who was about to get married, and all he could eat was chicken nuggets. And his fiancée had said, we are not having chicken nuggets at the reception. And she was dead serious, this is not going ahead. And so we treated our first case of ARFID, because we often think about it as happening in young kids. And he was a very fussy eater as a young kid. But his first presentation was a 28-year-old male, and successfully treated because he really wanted to get married. And she was holding the line. Christine used this slide, which is understandable because I stole it from her. The one, and I kind of put it there, I was going to take it out to not, Christine stole my stuff. But it actually is so much more relevant than stats and stuff like that, because this is kind of what people say, and this is the stuff I hear 6 hours a day. Tone in my head, screaming abuse, like the level of self-hatred that can go with eating disorders is just phenomenal. Probably the case, the story, I guess, that sticks out most in my head was someone with a very long-term eating disorder and depression. And she sort of comes to the conclusion, I'm not going to get married, I'm not going to have kids as a consequence of anorexia. So I'm going to be the best auntie that I can ever be. But as her illness kept progressing and when she went into more acute phases of the illness, this stuff in her head would just be so strong about how awful and evil and how bad she was as a human being. It got to a point where she wouldn't go anywhere near her niece and nephew because she thought at some level her sense of badness would be so catching and her toxicity as a person would be so catching that she didn't want them to get almost infected by her badness. And I'd love to tell you that I think that that's an isolated extreme case. I don't think it is. It's this constant diatribe of self-hate running through your head. And one way to maybe shut it off is to do what it tells you to do. So it tells you to not eat. So it's actually quite a sensible thing to do. It doesn't work, but it's quite a sensible thing to do what you're told. Think of anyone who's worked in domestic violence. That is how a perpetrator works. I will shut up when you do what you want. And if what I want you to do is to lose weight, because that's all that you're worth, you're going to do that just to get some relief. And there's lots of processes of that, and a lot of them involve serotonin and a lot of them involve neurochemicals. Because the process of binging and restriction just changes your biochemistry so much. After a binge per episode, I felt like I'd been hit by a truck. This ain't comfort eating. Numerous times when ending it all crossed my mind because I was so tired. We'll come back, keep that one in mind, we'll come back to that one. This, I think, is a really powerful and a really common. I was recently asked to sum up my experience of anorexia nervosa in one sentence. Actually, I can do it in just one word. Isolation. You feel completely alone. Christine talked about how common eating disorders were. The myth is, and I think it's a political myth, that they're rare. Because if they're rare on a structural, systemic level, we don't really have to care about them. And if we also think that they're really kind of disorder of young women who, and they're all kids, so they don't have any power, they don't have a vote. So maybe if they're rare and we just sort of stereotype it, we actually don't have to take eating disorders particularly seriously, which just means that we don't actually have to fund things properly. Just to put some context around the numbers, prevalence of a psychotic illness is about 1% of the population. Nobody's going to go that a psychotic illness is rare. Anorexia is just about as common as a psychotic illness. Bulimia nervosa is 50% more common again. And when you include BED, you get up to 3.5% prevalence rate. Point made, I feel. Third most common chronic illness of young women. 10 times more common than diabetes. And as a double barrel, if you have diabetes, you're 2.5 times more likely to also get an eating disorder. And that's a really complicated comorbidity. All those figures, there's people who make diagnosis. And to make diagnosis, you've got to be in treatment. And there's a whole heap of people that aren't accessing any form of treatment. And then there's a whole bunch of people, this is from Philippa Hay, who's here today, from a study in Adelaide, I think, that really looking at some of the eating disorder behaviours that people who aren't just in a community sample are presenting with, So up to about 20% probably have a diagnosis of some type of eating disorder. I don't know what people define as rare. 20% ain't rare. So diagnosis, tip of the iceberg. Let's go a little bit beyond that. We're going to talk a little bit about dieting down the track. This is from Simon Wilsh and Tracy Wade. And Tracy Wade was mentioned this morning about having a seat on the, what's it called? The Million Minds. That's a good name, Million Minds. And eating disorders has a seat at that table, which is just awesome. If you have a look, yeah, it's a really consistent kind of figure. There's about 23% of women have had clinical levels of disordered eating behaviours and attitudes in the past 12 months. And the data's a bit old because it only goes to 2016, but look at the change. In 6 years, we almost doubled in terms of the percentage of people having disordered eating. Why is that important? Because, do I have a pointer? No, yeah. Because if you diet, you're 18 times more likely to develop an eating disorder if you're dieting for 6 months. If you diet for over 12 months, you've got a 1 in 5 chance of developing an eating disorder. Because when people diet, they don't diet for 6 months and 12 months. And people who go on to get eating disorders, they diet in a completely different way. Like the last time I tried to diet, I don't know, 3 days and then there was a party, or I really know I'm going to abstain from that, blah, blah, blah. I'm going on holiday, so, or there's something there to eat, which is nice. Literally 2 days. I actually do not have the structure of the brain of someone who can go, or the genetic makeup of someone who can go on to do that. Most diets statistically last 4 days, which is you start on Monday, by Thursday, kind of like, it's over because the weekend's coming up. So this again is when we're around the campfire at Uluru and Celeste is going, I want a little bit of that eating disorder. What she's actually saying is that it's not really a serious kind of thing. We don't really have to worry about it. And again, little political statement, we don't actually have to fund their treatment. Times are changing. Why in primary health do we need to know about eating disorders? Because they're the second leading cause of mental illness for young women. Just going to pause and let that drop. It's an old therapy trick. We just pause, go silent, things drop. When people first said to me stuff like, can I have a bit of that anorexia? I actually first, I hate to say it, I actually ignored it and just went, whatever, okay. And people would kind of laugh and we kind of move on. Then I got sort of pissed off and just got angry and started lecturing everybody. But like lecturing people is apparently not a good way to lead to behaviour change. Like some other clinical psychologists have found that out. Well, how did I know that? So now I actually take a slightly different, more toneful, almost collaborative, slightly manipulative approach to these conversations. Never invite me out. I swear to God, I do this. It's weird. My wife just goes, please stop. Just tell them you're a golf professional. But then you can't educate people. This is every time someone says something crazy, it's a great opportunity just to educate one person around a campfire. It's pretty cool. You want to drop this out. So I said something, well, Celeste was probably about, 55. So I said to her, I didn't ask what her age was, I'm not that socially inappropriate. It's kind of like, well, do you know if you'd had this illness for 20 years? So you kind of got it in your 30s and you continued it for 20 years. Do you know there's a 20% chance you wouldn't be here today? I got that reaction around the campfire. I'm going, okay, we're on a roll here. She had a daughter. Her daughter was 23. I said, okay, so your daughter's 23. If she gets an eating disorder, or she has an eating disorder, compared to someone who doesn't have an eating disorder who's 23, Do you know she's 5 times more likely to be dead? This is a really serious illness. We touched on this a little bit before. When I did the interview for the 7:30 report, they got me to say this about 8 times. So I thought, this is something that gets in people's kind of heads all the time, because it's just mind-blowing. That actually, not only is it medically a really complicated illness, which we'll get to, but suicide is the second most common form of death in people with anorexia nervosa. So, Celeste, if you had an eating disorder, you are 32 times more likely to kill yourself than if you don't. At this point, Celeste is like running to the bar. She's going, who's this crazy man talking to me? But 32 times higher in anorexia nervosa. 20 times higher in major depression. So what that means is more people with anorexia nervosa will suicide than people with major depression. Why we have to understand it and get in there and treat it. And I think what that tells me is, one, we're a lot better at treating people with depression. We have lots more available treatments, particularly medications, than we do in anorexia. But it also speaks to the horror of what it's like to have anorexia nervosa. And yet, so if it's that horrible, right, you think, you'd come to my clinic and I'd be like, well, it's pretty horrible, you've got all these sorts of suicide, let me help you take it away. That would make sense. That's not how someone with an eating disorder's brain is kind of wired. Like, I've just asked you, I know this is a really horrible way to live, and on one level you really hate it and you want to die, but it's also who you think you are as a person. And that is why, an advanced workshop on treatment of eating disorders spends basically a day and a half looking at that dilemma. Because once you get that right, the rest isn't that hard. There's just some data, again, to back that up from Sweden. People with eating disorders is about a 2% suicide rate, and it's higher in every diagnosis of an eating disorder. I love this slide. It's a horrible slide. You probably can't read it. I'm hoping you can't read it. In fact, I might just make it smaller so people can't read it. What this says, this is a list of physical complications. And a good thing about, let me rephrase, a good thing about a physical complication. A useful thing about a physical complication is that if someone presents in a primary health setting, looking at some of these things, we can actually start backwards and go, oh, I wonder if they might have an eating disorder. That's why this slide is really important. Also, it's really big. It affects every single organ of the body, like including skin. But it affects the really big ones like liver, kidneys, heart, brain. These are important things. But what's important about here is I had a very disgruntled associate in my office sitting on my couch going, I cannot believe it. I just saw a kid who the mother was extremely worried about because she'd lost her period for 6 months. So she, absent of menses. She had 1 or 2 periods, presented to a GP, and this is not my attack on GPs, it's my attack on the entire health system and the lack of training in eating disorders, because you can only detect something if you know what you're looking for. And if you know what to do, is the other feature. But this kid presented with a loss of periods. She hadn't had a period for 6 months. Mum was really worried. Listen to mums. Parents know when their kids are in trouble. The GP said, not sure what's happening, come back in 6 months and we'll review. My associate, instead of having someone with a 6-month history of an eating disorder, now is treating someone with a 12-month history of an eating disorder. And that's just time that we don't have. And so for anyone in a medical kind of setting, knowing this stuff is really important. Or, I love the NEDC. Let's pick a target area that may be able to pick up people with eating disorders, oral and dental. They've got a booklet for dentists. The reason is, if you're purging a lot, the enamel on your teeth goes. So you present at the dentist quite a lot. So not only do specialists in hearts and endocrine and gastros need to know stuff, generalists in primary healthcare need to know the consequences of eating disorders, because that is what people will present for. That kid that went to that GP didn't present for an eating disorder. They presented for absence, they presented for a physical symptom of an eating disorder. This is the slide that says we need everybody in primary health to know about eating disorders. We've talked about the medical, psychology, social work, counsellors. Everybody needs to know about them because of the mental health kind of aspects. The psychosocial kind of aspects. So like we need every health professional to know about these stuff. I don't know where you guys are from, but there's a role for dietetics, OT, social worker, mental health nurses. This is such a complicated illness. You need a multidisciplinary focus. And in primary health, it's about knowing the signs and the symptoms and the risk factors so you can detect early, start treatment if you can, or refer on if you can't. Great document, so good in lobbying, and it just tells us the burden, not just on individuals, but on the whole health system of eating disorders. And it's worth knowing about it because it's actually a funding argument. In 2012, the health system, so the costs from the government, but also out-of-pocket expenses, was $100 million, which pales into comparison when you look at what's called productivity impacts and burden of disease, which was 15 or 52 billion. That's billion with a B. The number's actually too big to get your head round. My point with this slide is if we can detect early and treat early, we can save a lot of money. And the argument is, if we're going to save a lot of money at the back end, let's bring adequate funding to the front end. Let's actually fund something called the evidence base of eating disorders. Funding it adequately is what Christine was talking about this morning. So from an economic perspective, it's a serious illness. Latest butterfly survey of 700 people. This is impact on families in particular. Like, again, stop and get your head around this. 55% of consumers, 55% had lost work or study. Like, think of the ongoing impact of that. 78% of carers lost work or study hours. 33% went into debt to fund their treatment. So they're maxing out credit cards. They're remortgaging their houses. We're trying to encourage people to be independent. I can't afford treatment. I've now got to go and live back home. And this one is just horrific because incomplete treatment is just so unhelpful. 25% had to delay or stop treatment due to the cost of it. That's part of the financial burden on families. Poor old Celeste is also making the idea that eating disorders are a choice. And this will get maybe a little bit geeky and involve brains and stuff, but I'm assuming there's no neuropsychologists in the room, so I can just use lots of Latin words and sound smart when talking about the brain. I know nothing about the brain. Just don't let my patients know that because I talk about it a lot. My big point, eating disorders are a disorder of neurobiology. They are not a disorder of the catwalk.
Yes.
Thank you, I got cheered. So, I just wish more people would know that.
Yeah.
So what causes eating disorders? We haven't got 6 months to cram here by 1 o'clock. They are very complex. There is no single cause. The more and more we do research, we are finding and this sort of goes to your question, if like 8 people go on a diet, why does only 1 get an eating disorder? We're starting to understand the genetic vulnerability, the psychological vulnerability, and the sociocultural vulnerability. There's like billions of dollars spent on genetic research, but yet I can bring it down to 1 slide, which seems a little bit not right. What we know about eating disorders, particularly anorexia nervosa, but there's an emerging database in bulimia, nervosa, and binge eating disorder as well, runs in families, highly hereditary. Genes play a really important role, particularly in anorexia nervosa. The more data that we get, there's not an anorexia nervosa gene, there's a combination of kind of genes, which is quite like the genetic, the genetic vulnerability to OCD and also to a psychotic illness, which is kind of interesting. I don't really understand what it means, but it's kind of interesting. I'm sure it means something, and people like Tracy Wade will work it out for us. What we also know, though, is that in a way the genetic vulnerability lies dormant. And so you can have it, and it make no difference to you whatsoever. You're probably likely to be quite perfectionistic, maybe a bit anxious, but that's kind of okay. What happens here, what epigenetics is the interaction between genes and environment. What turns that genetic predisposition on is weight loss. And so if you have the predisposition and you lose weight, that turns on and you get completely trapped. The way that you start to process information changes. Your focus of attention narrows right down to very fine detail. And so the fine detail that my patients focus on is their weight and their shape. And they have a great problem, and it gets worse as you lose more weight. They have a great problem in actually seeing the big picture. So think Monet's water lilies, which if you ever see them is on like kind of huge wall. And you have to actually stand right back to see them. It's like my patients go right up to and go, look, there's a blue pixel and there's an orange pixel, and that's great. And they can't step back and see the big picture. So they're focused on controlling weight and shape because of these changes in their brain. And again, because of changes in their brain, it's difficult for them to step back and go, although I'm focused on my weight and shape, my life is falling apart, my family is falling apart, I'm losing my job, there's all these medical complications. They just can't see it because it's not how their brain is wired to do it. And once that genetic stuff turns on, it gets worse and worse and worse. And they get trapped into a cycle of anorexia. It ain't a choice. It's just what happens. And the only way to turn that gene off is to regain weight back up to a normal. Regain weight, improve nutrition. It's the only way to turn it off, which is where our treatments are important. The weight part of treatment is really important. I want to apologize. This is not my slide. There's one thing horribly, horribly wrong with this slide. It uses the term anorexic women and normal women, okay? I'm going to work at getting rid of it. It buggers up the slide, but I'm going to work at getting rid of it. Think your classic eating disorders textbook where you have a very emaciated person looking at themselves in a mirror, and what you see in the mirror is something that's much larger. We get to this kind of fascinating area of body image stuff. And I really like parts of this slide because it was a study done by Sanjeev and Mondrati. And the people with eating disorders were pretty much all my patients. And the people without eating disorders were pretty much my psychology students, which is a terrible sample. But so this is a amalgamation of a whole lot of people's brains that I know, which just like freaks me out. It's pretty cool. What they did was putting a person under a fMRI, measuring blood flow, and they're trying to measure it to the visuospatial section, which is like the projector bit at the back of the brain, which that's probably not how it actually works, but that's how I understand it to work. When people with anorexia look at other people, lots of brain activity. When people without eating disorders look at others, very similar. Like you can just spot the difference. Like it's not unclear where this metaphor is going, but very similar. When people without eating disorders are looking at themselves, again, very similar brain activity. When somebody with anorexia looks at themselves, they don't get any visual spatial blood flow. They can't see what is in front of them. Like it's not, I choose to be thin. It's like, I'm not getting anything. Where the blood flow goes is to the amygdala, which is the fear center of the brain. Any spider-phobics here? There's always a spider-phobic in the room. Okay, thank you. If I had a spider and had it here, it would look about 3 times as big to you as it did to anybody else in the room. When we're scared, things look bigger. So if you're looking at your body and your fear center of your brain goes off, your body looks bigger. So what you do is you try and fix it because that's the information your brain is giving you. It's a wiring problem. And it takes a long time to help somebody who's suffering to get that. And that's a really helpful picture for clinicians kind of in the room to show them because and parents as well, like this is not your kid's fault. Like, and it's not your fault. You didn't like rewire your kid's brain. You didn't do this. It's just a thing that's happening right now that we just have to look at and deal with. So who is at risk? Uh-oh, looked at the clock. There's over 30 risk factors, of which some we can do stuff about. And this comes from a series of slides on prevention of eating disorders. So the things that we would target in prevention, but these are the psychological risk factors. Perfectionism and low self-esteem. A better way, if you really want to get your heads around eating disorders, read The Golden Cage by Hilda Brooke, who is a psychodynamic writer, who didn't really talk about low self-esteem. What she talked about was a sense of ineffectiveness. So think about that story of toxic badness. It's a sense of I cannot achieve anything in the world. And yet I'm also perfectionistic and really want to control things and achieve things. But yet I also feel that I'm completely unable to do that. And start thinking about that as a cycle that goes on and on and on and round and round and round. They're probably the core psychological, what we call setting conditions, I guess. Perfectionism and low self-esteem. Body dissatisfaction is there as a major risk factor. Internalization of the thin ideal, which is where you're on Instagram, which I'm not on, but I don't really understand it. But you're on Instagram and you show someone a picture of one of the thin people on Instagram, and you ask them, what do you think about this person? And they go, they're happy, they're successful, they're wonderful, they're popular. And all those kind of beliefs that we have attributed with weight are internalized. And of course, the major risk factor is dieting. Okay. So again, thinking about what your service is, and when people come into your room, what they might, who's likely to be at risk, okay? Wherever weight in performance is linked. So, athletics, drama, acting, running, rowing, anywhere where anyone weighs anybody and goes, well, you can't be in this crew because your weight is too high. You can't be in the first aid because your weight is too high. Just saw a bunch of rowers. People under periods of transition. And this is a slide I'm going to change because you've got kids presumably doing the HSC, so you're transitioning from school to work or university. It's a big time of stress. Or actually when you leave university, you have to go and get a real job. The point I keep making to my children. Big time of transition and stress. It doesn't have young people who are transitioning from primary school to high school. Big stressful time. Kids going through menarche. Big time. The other group that's not missing there is older people who have eating disorders. There's massive times of changes. White male up here may not really understand the level of kind of change, but there's a peak of presentations of older people who are going through menopause. Thinking there's a whole lot of hormonal changes, but there's a whole lot of changes to body, there's a whole lot of changes to sense of self. Who am I? When your kids leave home is a time of transition where we see little peaks. And it may be people who had eating disorders or disordered eating in their adolescence, these changes are kind of reawakening that. Or it may actually be this is the initial onset in late age onset. Also when people retire, and the other thing is when husbands retire. Yeah, some people go, yeah, I hear you. When husbands retire, it changes the entire dynamic of the family and roles kind of change. And if your brain is wired to need to be in control of everything, like a lot of those stresses to a lot of people aren't, I just went to university, whatever. But if your brain is wired to need to be in control of everything, it's a big shift. And of course, like anyone who's been bullied, and particularly weight and shape bullying is associated with onset of eating disorders. Most common risk factor is body image concerns and dieting. Now the problem with that slide and why I put that little bracket there is that eating disorders are much more than that. And when we talk about eating and dieting as a risk factor, we can start to moving, oh, maybe it is a disorder of the catwalk. No, it's not. We've made that point. Again, this is from Simon Wilsh and Tracy Wade. Body dissatisfaction, 50% of boys, 75% of girls. Adolescents in the healthy weight range, 33% of boys think they're overweight, 50% of girls believe they're overweight. And the Mission Australian survey, it is consistent that body image concerns and eating disorders are amongst the top 3, and they're usually number 1 amongst adolescents. Okay. So we've talked about, these are important things to know about. We've talked a bit about who might get them. What we're going to move on to is talk about in primary health kind of settings, how you might detect, how you might screen, and how you might start a conversation, and then where to go after that. Okay. So detection and screening, and in primary healthcare settings, this is one of the most important things that I want you to get your head around. Completely stolen from NEDC, thank you. Really nice slide. Observe the physical, psychological, and behavioural warning signs, of which we will put a massive list up, which you can't possibly read in the time, but we'll go through it. Listen. Listen to people's concerns. So if you're in primary healthcare and mum or dad comes in and says, I think there's a problem, you know, families have had a rough time in eating disorders. And when I say families, I mean mothers in particular. When I first started over 20, I'll admit 25 now, years in the field, almost the treatment of choice was put someone in hospital and get them away from their parents. And then suddenly they'd go back in their family and they'd relapse. And we'd go, see, that's clearly proof that families are to blame for eating disorders. We, and I'm very happy to admit it, were a bunch of idiots at that point. Families are the best resource that you can have. It's almost like a stunning revelation. This was heresy when I first started saying it. I think the parents know their kids more than we do, team. And people would go, what? We're like professionals and stuff. And I'll go, like, they're parents, they know their stuff. So listen to the concerns. If you're in a school setting and someone says, I think that Peter or Mary might be vomiting, take it very, very seriously. And ask. Something about eating disorders and food and weight. We don't ask questions. And I guarantee you 100% of the time, you will not find an eating disorder if you don't ask about eating. But we'll talk about how you might want to do that. So again, this is just about knowing what the warning signs might be. Unfortunately, the psychological warning signs, changes in emotional state, black and white thinking, distorted body image, describes about 98% of young people. But the point is, you don't look for one thing and go, ha-ha, that's it. You're looking at clusters of kind of symptoms. Kids that go on to get eating disorders get really preoccupied with eating food, weight and shape. And by preoccupied, I mean they get quite obsessed by it. When they're talking about it, they'll talk about it quite differently to their peers. They'll get quite elevated, they'll get quite excited by it. Physical, weight loss or weight gain, really hard for some people to work that out. Like parents can't often see that because they're living with their kid all the time. We get a bunch of referrals after the Christmas holidays from coming in from school counsellors going, wow, we've just seen this kid's weight either go up or down. And they've noticed it because they've got only 2 time points when parents have a lot of time points. But again, it's the things like people complaining with gastrointestinal problems. Now, there are people who just have gastrointestinal problems that don't necessarily have eating disorders. So again, just looking at clusters of symptoms. Again, dieting in of itself, it's a risk factor, but you need the whole cluster. There are more obvious kind of behavioural things like frequent trips to the bathrooms after meals, changes in clothing styles. Not a good day to talk about today, but when it's like a 30 or 40 degree day and there's someone who's presenting to your service in an overcoat and a jacket, what they're doing is likely either experiencing high levels of body shame. So they may not be underweight and trying to hide it, they may just have high levels of body shame. That was very intrusive, I hardly noticed at all. But they may be trying to cover up a level of emaciation. In fact, when I first started talking to schools, I actually asked the patients, who do you think should have detected your eating disorders? And almost to a person, they said the PE, obviously it was older before PhEDP or whatever it is came up, the PE teacher or the sports teacher should have picked it up. Because I never changed in front of everybody. I hid all the time. I didn't do any school swimming carnivals. I love doing sport and I'd run around doing sport because it's a great way, but not a swimming carnival because that showed off my body. They actually play sport quite differently. Like it's not about enjoyment, it's actually about winning. The perfectionist and the competitiveness, it's actually about, so they're not, people with eating disorders aren't actually great at playing team sports. You'll usually find them in individual competitive kind of sports. Anyone who reacts really strongly to anything you say about body weight or shape, kind of to me it's like, oh, there might be something kind of just beneath that. So there's lots of warning signs. Again, I cannot plug this website enough. It is a one-stop shop of, if you've got a question, it is the answer to all my questions. So just check out the NEDC. In fact, I should have it here on a computer and I could just sort of Google stuff as people ask hard questions. Mental health first aid is another good list of warning signs and things to just look out for. And they're good kind of pamphlets just to have around your service in primary health. So parents can pick them up, kids can pick them up, the rest of your teams can pick them up. Really important. Few people present to my office saying that they have a problem with their eating. They're usually being dragged along by a parent or a partner. But certainly in a really primary health setting, very few people go, I'm here for help with my eating. They might present for weight management if they have binge eating disorder. They might present for anxiety or depression, or for the medical complications, for amenorrhea, for coldness, for lethargy, for tiredness. And that's why knowing all those, you don't have to be a GP, knowing those signs is really important because it just gives you a cluster of things to look for, to identify. One of the other reason why few people will volunteer an eating disorder is it goes back to that sense of self comment. No one wants to just give away what they've based their entire identity on. So there's ambivalence is one way of looking at it, but it's actually just a terror of having to make a change. And again, the neurobiology of this is not wired to make changes. Flexibility is not a characteristic that goes with the way that these brains are wired. And so the idea of change is terrifying. So why would I tell you that I need help with it, even though I'm miserable and thinking of killing myself? And this is the complexity of eating disorders. So we're looking for clusters of behaviour and go back to point number one. Weight and appearance is a terrible indicator of whether somebody has an eating disorder. You may be able to pick up someone with quite severe anorexia nervosa, but the amount of people that you're going to miss. And as Christine was saying this morning, early detection leads to early intervention, and within 2 years, that improves the recovery rates and risk of physical consequences. That's like a mantra, I think, of today. And it kind of goes to ask, whenever I go to a GP, they'll ask me about sleep, and I'll go, what is that? I don't know anymore. They'll ask me about smoking, and I'll go, no, who would do that? And they'll ask me about alcohol use, and I'll probably at that point just start lying to my GP and go, no, you refer patients to me, of course. We wouldn't do that. But they're very comfortable asking those questions. But people get very uncomfortable asking questions about eating. Note the question is about eating and not a question about your weight. There's very few reasons anybody has to weigh anybody else. When I was in Uluru, I went on a helicopter ride and they had to know my weight. And I was quite happy for that because I didn't really want the helicopter to crash because I got on my high and said, there's no reason for you to know my weight. There was. People would die. Besides that, there's not really any great reason. Because weight is such a terrible marker of health. It actually doesn't mean anything. One thing we do know is that patients with eating disorders, bulimia nervosa in particular, present to their GP a whole heap more for consequences of their eating disorder than people without eating disorders. They utilise the health service, so these are people that we can detect. And we're not detecting them, and that's why in bulimia nervosa there's usually a 7-year gap between your first presentation to the GP and diagnosis. So by the time someone then gets a diagnosis of bulimia nervosa, they actually have a chronic health condition. So if we pick it up early and we ask the right questions, everything gets a lot easier. One of my favourite studies. It's by Anthea Ferslin for the Clinical Centre for Interventions. And one of the other great websites in the field of eating disorders is the CCI website. Particularly if you're doing a guided self-help or if you're just seeing somebody in primary health, they have a heap of modules based on evidence-based treatment that are incredibly helpful. Probably the most helpful thing out there. But there's two wings of the Centre for Clinical Interventions. One is an eating disorders clinic. The other is anxiety and depression. And what Fursland and Watson did is they went into the anxiety and depression clinic. And they used a questionnaire, which I'm going to show you in a bit, the SCOFF, and they gave it to the people who were not presenting for eating disorders. 18% had probable eating disorders, 7% had definite eating disorders. So they weren't there to talk about food, weight, or shape. They were there for treatment of anxiety, depression. 25% have likely eating disorders. They had never before that thought to ask the clients with anxiety and depression whether they had any problems with their eating. It's about learning to ask the questions. And they didn't interview them. They didn't set up a really safe kind of space for them. They literally gave them that questionnaire, which some people go, no one's going to fill out a questionnaire. Honestly, I go, well, 25% of people did. I would imagine there's another 25% that just went, no, to all these kind of questions, but we picked up 25%. That's really good. And we learnt we have to ask the kind of questions. Really simple questionnaire. And the people who got it, they actually said, what was it like for you just to have this questionnaire? And they went, yeah, that was all right. Some went, oh, it was really good someone asked about it. Do you make yourself sick because you feel full? Do you worry you've lost control over how much you eat? Have you recently lost over 6.35? It's an English thing. I think that's 2 pounds or something in a 3-month period. Do you believe yourself to be fat even when others say that you're too thin? Would you say food dominates your life? And if you say yes to 2, that doesn't mean they've got an eating disorder. It just means you've screened someone who might have more of an issue that they were letting on, and you can just ask some more questions around that. Or you can even just ask, if you can ask, some more questions around that. There's a new one for binge eating disorder that's come up. It's too wordy to read, but you can Google bed 7 and there's a nice little pamphlet with the questionnaire on it. And again, if you just say no to the first one, you don't have to fill out the thing. It's just a screening questionnaire. It's not a diagnostic thing. It just gives you an idea that maybe I should be asking more questions. These 3 questions are just quite indicative of someone, and you can just ask them with sensitivity. Are you satisfied with your eating patterns? What do you think about your eating patterns? That didn't sound like a horrible, intrusive kind of question. What do you think about it? How's your smoking? How's your sleep? How are you feeling about your eating? Do you eat in secret? That's a big one. Do you ever feel out of control with your eating? And again, if there's a yes to those things, they're just ideas to start a conversation, which we want to talk about how to perhaps have safe conversations with people. 2 common approaches. One is, oh my God, they might have an eating disorder. I will not ask any more questions. Or, I'm just eat because that's what will fix you. That's not a safe conversation. You have anorexia nervosa and you have to eat now. Say that to anybody with anorexia nervosa, you're never going to see them again, even if you're like a wonderful human being. You blew it. So, these are some do's and do nots, just ways to think about it. And like if you're trained as a therapist, this is just what we do. The tone is open, collaborative, gentle, curious, inquisitive, respectful. Actually act as though you don't know anything, which I'm sure a lot of patients think I don't know anything. But We just go really slowly, really gently. Avoid diagnostic labels. Don't even go, I think you've got an eating disorder. Immediately, our first starting point is not really about food or weight symptoms. Not commenting on appearance. You'll get to the food and weight stuff. Like, you can't just like avoid it. That's a bit ostrichy. But not commenting on appearance. I noticed that you've lost a lot of weight over the school holidays. Or last time I see you, you've gained a lot of weight. In fact, just don't do that as a general nice human being thing to do. Don't comment on weight and stuff. Be empathic and supportive. All therapists here, we're genetically programmed to be that way anyway. So again, just gentle, open questions. Therapeutic conversations is what we're trying to have. I am concerned. I do it tonefully. That seemed a bit harsh to me. I am concerned. It's more like, I'm concerned about you at the moment. I've noticed that you seem to be preoccupied, and then you insert the consequence of the eating disorder. So you might be distant, or you might be having trouble concentrating, or you might be, I noticed that your moods are changing. You seem a bit more irritable or a bit more down. So we're not going in talking about weight, and we're not going in talking about shape. We're not using a diagnosis. We're knowing what the consequences of the eating disorder might be, because that's what people present with to change. Even if they're not presenting to change their eating disorder, they are presenting to deal with the mood and the physical symptoms that go with that. So if you're targeting what they're likely to want to change, if that's your focus, you're actually engaging them in a collaborative conversation. How have things been for you lately? And one of my favourite questions is just, what do you need at the moment? So, again, you can't just not talk about food. So general kind of questions. Notice we're talking about food. We're not necessarily talking about what your weight is. What would you eat on a typical day? Open-ended, gentle, non-accusing, curious kind of question. Destigmatizing questions. These are the like, you're not alone questions. Many people actually, would you know that many people have a lot of concerns about food, a lot of concerns about eating, a lot of concerns about weight. Do you have any of these? Many people have trouble with eating too much. Has that ever been a problem for you? They're just gentle, open-ended kind of questions. And I think really importantly, my follow-up question to all that is this okay for us to talk about? Because it's not like, aha, I've been open and engaging, therefore we started a conversation and life is a linear process and definitely they'll want to continue that conversation. Keep asking for permission. In fact, it goes a little bit to the weighing people all the time and getting people to keep food diaries all the time. Like as an eating disorder specialist, I get everyone to do that. So I just go, well, it's in the manual, it's really important treatment, we'll just do that. Without really thinking it through all the time, going, this is such a personal piece of information that I'm asking for. Like what a person's weight is, even if they know what the rationale is. What they're eating through the day can be, if they're binging, it can be such a shameful thing that this tone for it's important, like in an early stage of detection, all the way kind of through. So if the answer is no, it's not really okay to talk about it, then there's a question like, what do you do? Well, as best you can, this helps if you're a GP, I think. You need to assess the medical risk, because that really determines what you're going to do. If their electrolytes are out, if they're purging a lot, you really need to know what to do. If you're a psychologist in a headspace kind of clinic or a school counsellor, you have no idea what the medical risk might be. But it is actually pressing gently but persistently and respectfully, I'm really concerned about you, and I actually really need to know that things are safe. And if things are safe, that's okay. Doesn't mean the game's up and I'm never going to talk to you about it again. I'm still concerned about it, really glad that things are medically safe. I'm still worried about it. I'm going to come back. I'm just going to keep raising it in your next session or next time I see you or next appointment. And whenever there's a consequence, this is what motivational interviewing is all about. It's actually like finding what the consequence of the eating disorder is. What is the part of their experience that they don't want? And you keep talking about that over and over again. And you're juxtaposing, well, you're cold and you're worried that you can't have kids. What do you think that might be about? And you're just juxtaposing, this is what you want, this is what happens with an eating disorder, but I don't get to make the choice of what you do. I give it back to you to make a choice. If you're speaking, like everything I say, like you've got to filter it through what is the medical risk, do I know the medical risk, and also the age of the person that you're seeing, how you talk. I would talk to somebody of every age in that kind of way, with that kind of tone. I would alter it slightly if there's a younger person involved. If it's a child that you think has an eating disorder, I'd talk to the parents really quickly. And the reason for that is the parents are the major agent for change in child and adolescent kids with anorexia. They're the people that you actually have to get. It's very hard to motivate a 14-year-old with an eating disorder to attend treatment. The people you've got to engage with and build a relationship with is the parents. And in a lot of ways, they do a lot of the work. But I still talk to the young person about your concerns. Lots of different reactions to a safe conversation. Might be denial, might be angry, might be rationalizing, dismissiveness, but in a lot of the people that I've talked to, underneath it, I think there's a sense of, somebody's got my back. I'll tell you why I think that's really important. I was walking to the office in Mooroonga the other day, and I suddenly got an email, and it was a person going, hi, this might be really weird, like, I'm an ex-patient of yours, and I saw you in Mooroonga. You were just walking across the crossing, and I was driving. And I just thought I'd say hi, and that things are going okay. And patient got married, so I didn't actually recognise who it was, but she sent through some photos, and it came up, and I just went, I can't believe you didn't mow me down at the crossing. This kid hated my guts throughout treatment. We treated her in FBT. And it's one of my favourite traumatic memories. It's a weird thing to say. At the end of one of the sessions, like, we're doing FBT, and the kid just didn't talk at all. We just sit there. I went back and read my notes. It was like long periods of silence where the person just hated said therapist. And I think she was about 14 at the time. And mum was handing over some money to pay. And the kid grabs the cash and she starts ripping it up and she throws it in my face and says like rude things that I can't possibly say. But I think they're along the words of, I don't think you deserve any of this money. You're a horrible individual and I hope you die. And I'm thinking, well, you didn't mow me down with a car 15 years later, so that's pretty good. So I emailed her back and she sent me photos. She's now married, completely well, 2 kids, 2 beautiful, beautiful babies. I wrote back to her and went, well, look, thanks for saying thanks. That's really nice. It's not weird. It's not like weird at all. Yeah, I do remember you. I remember therapy seemed like quite difficult for you, or maybe for the eating disorder, because I had to keep a therapeutic tone and keep externalizing the eating disorder. And I got nothing back for 2 days. I thought, oh yeah, that's okay. And then she got back to me and she said, oh no, I really hated you. You are such an asshole. I didn't want to change. But what I want to thank you for is you stood up for me. You stood up for me against the eating disorder. And I then went on to see other therapists who didn't take a stand against the eating disorder. What I got is I tapped into that sense of relief
the kid was so relieved that someone had her back. And I had to put her in hospital a couple of times, but I wasn't going to let her die. And so there was a sense of kind of, I think there's someone there who's helping my parents have my back. There was a sense of relief in her. And I think actually if you look for it, you get it when you have a safe conversation. She's not a kid I thought would get well. Probably based on countertransfer of, oh, you hate me, so of course. So what do you do next? One thing you can do is think about making a referral. And this is where I'm going to kind of completely and utterly, I may be biased in this point. I run a specialist eating disorder clinic. This is all I have done. I have not seen, I got my first job, my day one, I probably wasn't licensed, it probably wasn't really a smart thing to do. I was going to do a 3-month placement in eating disorders, 3 months in mood disorders, 3 months somewhere else. I stayed in eating disorders because I just loved it. Because it was baffling and interesting and it made no kind of sense. So I'm like the most specialist you can see. I don't actually see any other patients for 25 years. And what often worries me, and this is not a comment about anything except our level of training of primary health clinicians and level of training of universities is abysmal and is the big gap that I can see. Like, it's kind of a jungle out there. I get really worried when I walk past a outpatient therapist's office and it's got, I specialize in, and there's a list of like 700 things that they specialize in. And that kind of concerns me because you can't be trained in everything. I changed specialist to specific this morning to probably capture more that I think you need training in these people. This is an intro, that's good. There are I know the government is rolling out training in evidence-based treatments, in family-based therapy and CBTE, so every local community health centre should have specific eating disorders training. Unfortunately, this week we got a call from one of our local teams who again said, this person has an eating disorder and we can't get onto the coordinator for the region, so they rang us. I don't really understand why, but that's a different story. They're really, really complicated, so they're not our core business. So where can we send this person? So we're not quite there with the idea that, no, we're rolling out lots and lots of training for you to be able to manage. Because there are things, well, they can't afford private treatment. What will we do? I don't know, provide treatment, I would have thought was the answer. And I'm happy to help, I'm happy to supervise, I'm happy to consult, that's fine. If you want to know where, again, I'm a bit over plugging NEDC website, but they do have like a really great database of eating disorder services, people who are trained and identifying themselves as, I think I can kind of do this. There are state-based organisations, particularly if you live along the east coast of Australia, they're much better service than anyone else. But again, like your local community health centres are all being trained to have the specialist training to be able to manage. They also, in their training, will have like, if things aren't going well pretty quickly, don't just keep doing, like consult, refer on. Like if you're not getting a lot of change by 4 or 5 sessions, that's actually a time to have a case conference and think about where are we stuck, what do we need to do differently. But bottom line, anyone who you think has an eating disorder needs a really quick assessment by someone, a mental health clinician, because that's important, but also a medical assessment. That's one of the things that I find most interesting about working with eating disorders is just that interface between the medical and the psychological. And this is my GP kind of story. That GP missed that case. But I don't blame the GP because they're not trained to pick up eating disorders. That's why I'm here on my birthday, just to remind everybody. To, just raise kind of awareness in these things. We've already fixed the health system, the Defense Department, that's awesome. These are just like a generic kind of stuff you should do slide, and like it's all about like, this is like being a good human being slide. Like, it's really specific to eating disorders or anything. It's kind of like model good stuff. Don't complain about your own body and your service. Weight is a terrible indicator of health. Just don't comment about like weight and appearance. Even compliments. Like, it's another personal revelation, but I have this beautiful, beautiful goddaughter who's just a lovely human being. And people will go up to her and go, "Oh, you look so pretty," and they'll do an appearance-based thing. So I, of course, will rush over and go, "And you did really well on that science assignment. You're really smart, and isn't that awesome?" And like this is the sort of person I've become. An advocate. It's terrible. Don't allow bullying to occur. This is, don't label your own food as bad, good, yes, no. Like, particularly if you're working with young people, and young people at risk, it just goes in. Like, we have a role just to model this stuff. Like in hospital, when I was in hospital working with people with eating disorders, I would just model healthy eating all the time. There's my emphasize non-appearance attributes and talents. Encourage media skepticism as much as you can. So whenever my friends are looking at kind of Instagram and they're going, isn't this person beautiful? I go, yeah, but are they happy? Which is like just a mean, horrible thing to say, but I'm trying to make a point. It's not about what everyone kind of looks like. We sort of touched on this before, like, be aware how your health messages are actually being delivered. And it's check your, and that should be in inverted commas, anti-obesity messages are perhaps not too strong. And this is a tough thing. This tough thing. Our field is just trying to get our heads around this. And like, the NEDC did a marvelous job getting people in the eating disorder sector to talk to each other, getting people from the eating disorder sector and the obesity sector to talk to each other. That's a whole different kind of ballgame because we think about things like really, really differently. Yet there's a whole lot of common kind of messages that we could be using. Like, weight, again, is a terrible indicator of health. Any kind of intervention that's promoting health needs to focus on health rather than focus on weight loss. If we're going to avoid fat is bad kind of messages and any weight stigma kind of messages. If we're going to have health promotion, we're looking at things that you can change. Like, weight may not be something you can change very, very safely. Physical activity, healthy eating habits, screen time, get rid of soft drinks. There are things that we can kind of talk about and things that we can kind of promote. Yeah, see, what a great audience. We segue nicely. If the reason that I put this up is like, if you're referring to somebody, or if you're going to start providing treatment, there are things you're going to want to think about and do. And if someone writes back to you and you've referred to them, there are certain kind of words you want to hear that are happening in therapy. Like, there are a lot of evidence kind of based treatments. And this is what's being rolled out to people across the state. So people are getting training in family-based treatment for young people, particularly with anorexia, but it can be a bit more general than that. And that's a pretty effective treatment. And get 30 to 40% of people who use it very well within about 20 sessions is the manual. We did some research on it, and people were getting well pretty much after about 14 sessions with it. So like, it's not a treatment that's going to cure everything, but like 30 or 40% in 14 to 20 sessions is a great early intervention. It's not an intervention that needs to be specific to clinical psychology. There is a manual that is quite easy to follow, and when that goes well, and you follow it, it does really well. It's when you get stuck that we need to think about what to do. CBTE, for people with bulimia nervosa and BED, again, if you follow that manual quite closely, about 70% of people will do very well. It's a really effective treatment. CBT for anorexia, I think the data is not quite as strong, particularly in adults. And I put guided self-help there because Beth Shelton's talking about it, but like now, next door, so you've sort of missed that, but I'm sure it'll be on video. That's a really interesting first line intervention. It doesn't take a lot of training to go through it. It's largely where, it's usually done where you give people a self-help book, usually called Overcoming Binge Eating by either Chris Fairburn or Peter Cooper, and you've read it as well, and you kind of go through it together. And again, it's not like this panacea approach, but in a primary healthcare setting, it's kind of a really doable, doesn't take a lot of resources. I know Beth is training Headspace people down in Victoria to do it as a first line kind of intervention. Then if it doesn't work, you go up to more specialist centres. But there's things that people can do in primary healthcare settings, get training at, which are pretty helpful. In fact, then we get into this a whole lot of other stuff and other packages, all that have bits of kind of data. In terms of what I do and the way that I kind of think about things, I get a bit sick of my registrars coming and going, I'm doing FBT. I go, well, I don't know what you're doing. That's a book. Like, that tells me you can read, and you, which is good in a registrar, and you can apply some of the principles, but what are you actually doing with the patient? And so a colleague of mine, Mandy Gull, sent me just sort of noodling with some ideas about what actually might be the core principles in an eating disorders treatment. Like, what do we actually do in the clinic room? And it's largely, we do evidence-based practice. Everyone talks about evidence-based treatment, which are the manuals, they're the books. Evidence-based practice is informed by the evidence-based, it's informed by clinical experience, and it's informed by patient feedback, like the feedback of I didn't run you down at Warunga, so what you did was probably helpful, thank you. It's really interesting to ask patients what they think. There's a whole list of, if you're fascinated by it, you can Google at home with eating disorders. There's a video of Mandy and I prattling on about core principles in, I did bulimia nervosa, which is pretty easy because that's largely looks like a CBTE. And Mandy did adolescent anorexia nervosa, which kind of looked like FBT, but FBT is really good for 30 or 40%. Our kind of thought is like, well, what do we need to do with the kids that aren't getting better with that? And so we're trying to draw from what's in the manuals and what we kind of think. Like, we're not out there doing like weird and wacky, let's all stand on our heads in the corner kind of therapy. It's based on really good kind of principles. So these are the core kind of things that, and you've got to sort of filtrate them. The emphasis differs based on how old the person is and a bit on the diagnosis. So motivation enhancement is there. My number one thing, and it gets ignored in most manuals, is actually the therapeutic relationship. And it goes to like, you're asking people about vomiting, you're asking them about binging. Like, you just don't get that information unless the space that you've created is a safe one. Like, therapeutic relationships are great. If you go to therapy, you can say whatever you like and people don't judge you. It's awesome. They're not like friends. There is a big part of it, and it's often an early part, on fixing the eating part of the eating disorder. And that's there, like, it's self-evident to a lot of clinicians, but it's the mistake a lot of clinicians make. They ignore talking about the eating disorder because it's hard, and it's hard for the patient, it's scary, it can be conflictual. But unless we're helping them change their eating, we're not probably doing them a service. And I include weighing in that. And take your point that if you're seeing a dietitian, a psychiatrist, a doctor, and a therapist, and they're all weighing you, and for different reasons, you can go balmy. And it actually misses the core underlying psychology. Because when we think about recovery, that's part of it. That's a medical and a physical recovery. But underneath that is the psychological recovery, which if you don't have a therapeutic relationship, you ain't going to get to. I'm quite big on individual case formulations. Let's meet together as people and kind of work out what's happening for you. FBT done by the book doesn't really do that particularly well, but another treatment for adolescents is what's called adolescent-focused therapy. There's lots of different variants of FBT that have pretty much the same kind of outcome. And what I like about an adolescent-focused therapy is someone is doing, it's usually somebody else, but somebody is doing the nutritional rehabilitation, but there's actually an individual therapist sitting down with the kid trying to work out what's your eating disorder about. There's no bad reason to have an eating disorder. They play a very core psychological function. And actually, sometimes if you're a bit stuck and just refeeding isn't kind of working, you need to unpick and understand what that function of the illness is before actually looking at tipping the balance and changing it. You got to teach people how to deal with their thinking, particularly their body image thinking, their overvaluation of food, weight, and shape thinking, and their feelings. Like if you're taking away someone's core coping strategy, they are going to feel really, really, really bad. So one thing you have to do is have the skills to teach them how do you match that. And actually say that, like, this is hard work, you're gonna feel bad, I'm taking away, collaborative, of course, something that has been really helpful for you. People don't do things that are unhelpful. So I'm gonna try and teach you some distress management skills, some emotion regulation skills that might replace the function of the eating disorder. Probably not as well, but with less consequences. And something that's like really important, and it doesn't really differ that much on age, I want to point out, is involvement of families. Obviously, if you're seeing a kid, you're involving the families. But if I'm seeing a married 40-year-old, I'll get the partners in as much as possible to do that. They're again A, can be a great resource, and B, they need lots of psychoeducation about that. You know, your partner is not making this as a conscious choice against you. They're doing it because this is how their brain is kind of wired. It helps kind of destigmatize. All I really wanted to say about that slide is like the story of the person who didn't run me down. Recovery is kind of possible. Despite apparently seeing me and hating me, recovery is possible. But recovery is kind of complex, is the point of this. A lot of outcome research is based on, well, these people don't make diagnostic criteria anymore. That's good, but it's not really recovery. It's a bit of a recovery, it's not the whole recovery. So let's filter through some of the outcome data about how they define outcome. Definitely no longer engaging in eating disorder behaviours and physically kind of healthy. That's a medical recovery, a physical recovery. But then we've got like a psychological kind of recovery. How you're dealing with your thinking, how you're dealing with your feelings. What do you think this eating disorder thing might have been about? How can I help you with like that stuff? If it's about those transitions, how can I help you manage transitions, how to manage that transition and future kind of transitions? Like it's not about, oh, your EDI scores have changed and your weight is now better, deal done. And a practical kind of recovery. So it's like recovery's whole of life, a holistic kind of recovery, which is not captured in the outcome literature at all. So there's a bit of summary, 2 hours and 3 lines. Could just put that up and save us all a bit of time. Eating disorders are common and serious. Like if you haven't got these points, what have you been doing for 2 hours? Early detection in primary care is like the most important thing. It is life-saving, suffering-saving, time-saving, resource-saving. Early and specific referral, very clear. It's like the one thing we actually know in eating disorders without a doubt. Early intervention, early treatment leads to better outcomes. There's lots of stuff we don't know, but that's pretty much one thing I can go, that is actual knowledge. That is fact. You've had, oh yes, there is one. How are you?
I just wanted to make a comment and maybe a question to you
Sure.
about that particular point about kids in school with,
Yep.
weight. Certainly one of the big things as a GP that I see, and also talking to pediatric colleagues, is that there is a explosion of type 2 diabetes in very young people in a primary school and also in adolescent population. How much information does, or how much collaboration does the Eating Disorders Network, talk to obesity people, people in the obesity space, health professionals in the obesity space, because I see eating disorders as a continuum of abnormal or malfunctioning dietetics and nutrition from childhood. And the whole question about antenatal care and women and, all of that. But it doesn't seem to me in primary care, in general practice, that there is much discussion amongst the obesity people and the eating disorders people.
The question I had is, why are you at an intro workshop?
Really, really good question. And I want to give you a really honest answer, because I do think in the time that I have worked in eating disorders, when I first started, it was really bad. One of the first things that we did when I joined the NEDC was to develop an integrated health promotion blueprint, was looking at exactly the issue that you were talking about. And it's not currently published, and we really couldn't get the obesity sector to engage. But there is a lot of hope that's currently going into it. The University of Western Sydney University has actually just set up a Centre for Excellence, a Centre for Research Excellence in eating disorders and obesity. And they have got a good mix of people from both sides of that table. We do see it as a spectrum. That's in all of the health promotion literature that NEDC puts out, is about looking at it in a spectrum. And, when Chris and Christine this morning were talking about the prevalence, particularly in obesity, anywhere between 1 in 3 and more than that, people who are experiencing life at a larger size also have binge eating disorder. So there really is a correlation, and the research is going to improve. I hope, I am confident in the centre that Philippa Hay is chairing out at Western Sydney Uni, and so they're going to start working together, more connected. Absolutely. And we are important for each other's successes. Most of the treatments that the obesity sector looks at don't work. They actually don't. And we know that one of the biggest predictors of obesity is actually dieting. So there's a lot more that we have in common that we could be helping to also address the issues, which I think, somebody have a question about bariatric surgery before? And I guess that kind of goes back to the same thing. It goes to what Chris was saying earlier. Bariatric surgery is very effective at treating a particular physical complication, obesity. It is the gold standard treatment for weight. But a bit in the same way that if you treat a person who has anorexia nervosa who has a cardiac issue, and you treat their cardiac issue, if you haven't addressed the anorexia nervosa, treating the cardiac issue is not going to make the anorexia nervosa go away. Likewise, if you have an eating disorder that is related to the reason that you are now living at a larger size, your surgery is not going to result in better psychological outcomes. And although there are some really good public services that actually take counselling and approaches to bariatric surgery seriously, Campbelltown Hospital is just setting up a program right now. It takes a whole year of going through processes to be able to get that. In the private sector, that is a very unregulated thing. And so you may not get an assessment that says whether or not bariatric surgery is going to address the health issues that you currently have, which is why you see that. But then conversely, in the same way that you're looking at the populations that Chris was talking about who might have a risk, and we know that people who are dieting, people who have really rigid reasons to be on a diet, diabetes being one of them, are at a higher risk of an eating disorder. So even if you didn't have an eating disorder prior, if you have some of those genetic predispositions, psychological predispositions that we were talking about, and you go through the process of having gastric surgery, bariatric surgery, and have to live with a lifestyle now that really restricts your food, you may well have actually increased your risk of developing something that you had a predisposition for. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, just going off of that, I was wondering what were some of the biggest barriers that you guys faced in trying to collaborate with people working in the obesity sector? Were any of them political? Just curious.
Look, so yes, there's
Yep.
always political. There's always political, and there are misconceptions around what we mean by obesity. So a lot of people, when they talk about obesity, they use the figure, they tend to say somewhere between 60 to 70% of the population in Australia are overweight or obese. Full stop. Obesity has. And so there's this perception that the population you're talking about is significant, and therefore the issues are more of concern, and if you create a little collateral damage on the eating disorder side, then that's what you've done to do good health work, which is not true for at least two reasons, and neither of which are moral, which is a really important one. And actually it's because the people that you're talking about when you're talking about obesity, as in people who have the mathematical equation of BMI that is actually a similar proportion to the population who have an eating disorder. They're actually a much smaller population that you're talking about, but because they're talking about overweight and obesity, there is this sense of collateral damage, really. But the other is practical. I think actually we do see a lot more buy-in from the people working in obesity-related illnesses who are working in public, who are working in health, who are actually, they are a lot more of what I would define as a choir. We are working together. One of the biggest challenges for the obesity sector is the significant proportion of weight management that happens with private organisations who are for-profit, who are selling particular products, and who may have great intentions. I'm not trying to cast aspersions, but when that is how you operate, that's a really different way to engage with somebody than, say, if you're engaging with public health and you're trying to get similar messages across.
I've learned at eating disorder conferences don't go into lunch. It's now 1:15.
Yeah, this is brilliant.
So thank you very much for your attention and this microphone.